Good morning. My name is Haru Ingram. I'm a senior research fellow with the program on extremism at George Washington University, and it's my privilege today to chair the opening panel featuring three really exceptional speakers who will be providing regional insights from South and Southeast Asia. Now, since 2017, I've travelled on average every 6 weeks or so into the region to run PVE capacity building programs, and the efforts of these scholars and their institutions more broadly have really significantly helped to shape how I understand trends across the region, and I'm sure that that has been the case for many of you here and listening in online. And so we have Aditya Dave, a research analyst with RUSI's International Security Studies Department, whose research focuses on South Asia. We have Kabir Taneja, an associate fellow with the Observer Research Foundation's Strategic Studies Program. And our first speaker for today is Nava Niranya, who's from the Institute for Policy Analysis of Conflict, IPAC. Broadly regarded, I think, by most in the field as really the leading kind of think tank for research on terrorism in Southeast Asia. And so thank you, Nava.
I have to do this every time. Good morning, everyone. Nava Niranya from the Institute for Policy Analysis of Conflict, IPAC, in Jakarta. We do research in Indonesia, Philippines, and also a bit of Malaysia. So I'm going to talk about just a broad overview of how extremist groups, especially in Indonesia and the Philippines, how their use of internet has evolved. And second of all, also about how internet helped facilitate women activism within jihadist groups. And also, thirdly, I hope I have time, I'm going to touch on the state response. Now on the, just the evolution. So, but we have to understand that the context of the conflict and terrorism are very different in Indonesia and the Philippines. In Indonesia, Muslims are the majority, have always been the majority. So when we first had the Islamist insurgency in the 50s, the aim was to turn Indonesia into an Islamic state. Whereas in the Philippines, where Muslims are, very minority, 5 to 10%, their aim is, and because of the long history of marginalization, center, periphery conflict, so their aim is to get autonomy. So online extremism has far more history in Indonesia than in the Philippines, partly because of different levels of internet penetration. In Indonesia, we see that the development of online extremism actually parallels the broader online media and also the booming Islamic publishing industry. Whereas in the Philippines, Islamic publishing industry is very low, almost non-existent, actually, not that much. So in Indonesia, you can follow the evolution from the time of, the listserv, the Yahoo, the email list, and then the MIRC relay chat. They moved on to Yahoo chat, and then password protected forum, and then finally, since 2011, because of the rise of smartphones, so they moved to social media like the rest of the population in Indonesia. Now we have 67 million Facebook users, and because for the Indonesia, the people who are active online for the extremists are mostly based in Java, when internet infrastructure is the best in the country. So that's why we see more of those activities online. Whereas in the Philippines, even in 2003, the leaders of MILF didn't even have email addresses. Because at the time, even in 2016, the internet access in Mindanao, which is different from Metro Manila, very different, it was only 1%. So we didn't have much going on the online realm. We first saw the Philippine extremist video in 2011, and that was by the convert, the Balik Islam militants, who came from Metro Manila and whose origin is from Salafi groups, or very media conscious, whereas the extremists in Mindanao, they mostly still relied on, the clan-based recruitment, ethnic, and so on. Although, of course, that's also changed later. Now, in 2014, we saw that in Mindanao, the rate of access to internet per household increased to 24%. At the same time, you have this ISIS brand started, getting popular in the world. And so it changed how internet was used in both countries. You started to see a lot of the online allegiance, even from the prisons, both in Manila and also in Indonesia. And but there is a difference. In Indonesia, when there was a direct instruction from Indonesians from Syria to use a telegram, the aim was to help Indonesians to get to Syria. So now we have over 600 Indonesians going over to Syria, mostly as family units. Whereas in the Philippines, the aim was to use the ISIS brand to support, to boost their local struggle. So their aim was to get acknowledgement from ISIS Central as East Asia Wilayah. Now, moving on to the second point about how internet help women activism. First, it serves as the window to the world for the women. They don't always need fatwa. All they need is inspiration and role model from other parts of the world. And second, it also provides women to access to extremist public space, which has been denied to them for a long time. In Indonesia, Jemaah Islamiyah used to tell women, no, don't fight, just cook and do the nursing stuff, whatever. Just don't fight. Same thing in the Philippines. But now with the internet, if men tell an extremist woman that they could just easily form their own cell or they could find other male leaders who are willing to accommodate women because they have strategic value as well. They're less suspected and so on. So we've got. Actually, in Indonesia, we started to have female suicide bombers in 2016, and 3 of them were former migrant workers, Indonesians who worked in Hong Kong and some of them in Taiwan and Singapore. This is a trend that these women and also Philippines have over 2 million migrant workers. So they got radicalized online, e-dating, e-marriage with foreign fighters or Indonesia-based fighters, and they help connect the networks internationally because they have confidence and they have foreign language skills, much more so than the locally based extremists. And source of inspiration. So we know that, so in May 2018, you've all heard about the bombings in Surabaya where 3 families blew themselves up, even though one of them accidentally so. But the 2 families actually bombed 3 churches and also a police office, and including very young children. And then in March, just last March, the same thing. The couple in Surabaya actually inspired another couple. It became a couple goal for other extremists. To do the same thing. So husband and wife doing, learning bomb making including from online materials. And is it really a surprise that we saw the same thing in Sri Lanka when the police were going to arrest the woman, the wife of one of the bombers, and then the woman just blew herself up with the kid as well. So this is something that we increasingly saw. Maybe they inspire each other. Maybe they see what each others have done through the internet. Now, lastly, on the response, I would say that it's very different in Indonesia and the Philippines. The Indonesia is already much more advanced, so the Detachment 88 has its own cyber patrol team, whereas in the Philippines, is because the military is still the lead agency in counterterrorism, so the emphasis is on killing, bullets, killing the leaders rather than understanding online radicalization. Just one last note. Even though in Indonesia it's got better, the government has been able to use the law or the information law to identify and ban extremist contents. The worry now in both countries is the freedom of expression. Now in Indonesia, increasingly the information law is being used to punish blasphemers and defamers, and in the Philippines as well. So what we have to be aware is that the proportionality of the problem. This problem affects, of course, the extremist terrorists use internet, but it doesn't justify the shutting down of Facebook or Telegram or even the entire internet in the countries. So I'll end my presentation there. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kabir Taneja. I'm an associate fellow with the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. And we decided to tackle an age-old conflict zone and try to understand its relatively new digital footprint. And I think it's important. I'm pretty sure everyone knows the modalities of the Kashmir conflict here, so I'm not going to get into that, otherwise we'll be here till tomorrow. But it's specifically with the rise of the Islamic State in 2014 and 2015, we saw a sort of global debate on the use of the digital sphere and radicalization. And why Kashmir posed a very interesting dilemma and a question is because the conflict had been in play for nearly, for decades. So this was not a new sort of form of or a new platform where radicalization could take place, but this was seen as a disruptor in an already very sort of streamlined conflict zone where there were pretty much three sides. One was, of course, the Indian side, one was the Pakistani side, and the freedom movement of Kashmir as well. So this literally, at the moment, I think GIF-CT has allowed, or this program has allowed to be one of the very first studies on studying the digital footprint in Kashmir as far as radicalization is concerned and counterterrorism is concerned. And there have been very worrying outcomes from what limited amount of work we have done till now. And just to quickly sort of color the argument in, we did field work for about 7 to 10 days. The day we landed in Srinagar, which is the capital of Kashmir, we landed in something called the Internet Shutdown. Now, just because the Prime Minister of India at that time was visiting the state, all internet services and telecom services basically are switched off. So millions of people who otherwise talk to each other or use the internet are shut out for a day or for 2 days. And this is all handled by the security agencies. So this was an interesting sort of, coming from New Delhi, never experienced an internet shutdown before. This highlighted an area of concern that the government was struggling with. They did not know how to approach it. And their inability to formulate policies or decisions on how to tackle the digital platforms in a state or in a conflict zone like Kashmir was to basically develop a switch which can just make the state go dark. And I think that's, of course, it doesn't need to be said, but hugely problematic. And that was why this happened is, of course, we can go back to around the year 2015 when there's one militant in the valley called Burhan Wani, who was with the Hizbul Mujahideen, decided or saw it apt to acquire the strategies employed by the Islamic State of creating content for themselves, for the group, for the militant group, and distributing it online. So he became the face or the poster boy, so to speak, of Kashmiri digital militancy. And he produced videos where his face was fully shown. His friends were seen loitering around with him, listening to music, having good food, while brandishing AK-47s. So, and he became very popular. So while we were doing our field work in the state, we could see Burhan Wani is a hero, graffitis all over the place. He was killed in 2016, if I remember correctly. And after his killing, he became sort of immortalized. So it was very counterproductive to the cause of fighting militancy in the state. And this sort of showcased a huge gap between the state, the center, and the platforms. The state didn't know what the center was doing to try and rectify its non-existent policies of countering terrorism online. The center didn't know what the state was doing. And I think both the center and the state had gaping holes on how or who was dealing with the platforms. So this is one of the sort of major takeaways that we had as far as this conflict or this study is concerned. But of course, we coming back to how it is being used. One of the main reasons why this has happened in Kashmir over the past 5-6 years specifically, and why Burhan Wani became Burhan Wani, is because Kashmir really came in the radar of Indian ISP providers over the past 5-6 years. We've had new services that have developed infrastructure for fast 4G internet activity in the state, which was non-existent, of course, even when the Indian telecom boom was happening in the early 2000s. So it only came to the state in 2005, 2006. And just to give it a little more perspective, I got better 4G connection 50 kilometers outside Srinagar while doing a field work than I did near the Parliament House in New Delhi. So it was much faster. The Kashmiri demographic is predominantly below the age of 35. And for a 6 GB pack in the state for data, you have to pay 80 pence. And that is absolutely nothing, even for in a state like Kashmir. So the accessibility became a driving point over the past couple of years. Now, the accessibility met with absolute mayhem whenever, as far as policies by the state and the center are concerned in trying to cope with this new threat. As we all know, Kashmir, most of the decisions are military decisions or policing decisions. They're not political decisions. And there have been, the state blames the center blames the state, and both of them have a very easy target in platforms. So if whenever some problem comes up, they said, well, the platform doesn't have servers here, so we cannot do anything to counter this threat. So it basically shows a very granular problem which the state and the center in India are facing right now. There is very little capacity building. We do have agencies that have been set up, but the agencies are not manned properly, they're not staffed properly with experts. And there seems to be an apathetic view of how to deal with this crisis, which is snowballing very quickly and faster than the state capacities and bureaucratic capacities can keep in touch. So I think that's a very quick outlook of what our paper looked out to do. And once it's out, of course, you can see the various other recommendations and reasons of how we approach this research. So I'll just end it at that.
Thank you. My name is Aditya Dave. I'm a research analyst at the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you to Brookings for organizing this. My paper for this project currently just looks at the broader South Asian region, specifically not looking at the Indian context currently because of Kabir's great fieldwork in the region. I looked at Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan as kind of case studies for this. And the first thing I kind of identified was the data gap for looking at this specific issue in the region. So while for this paper, I ended up doing kind of more secondary work and that kind of research for this paper, something that's been identified as for the next step for this process is to do a larger sort of data collecting, data gathering, data mining process for the region, which would help identify more concrete recommendations going forward. And some of the questions that are going to be taken up in the following presentations and how those kind of solutions can be implemented in the regional context as well. I think to reiterate what Kabir mentioned about, say, data access in the region, it is staggering how rapidly it has become more accessible and cheaper in the region. Just to highlight, in Pakistan, for example, the average cost of 1 GB of data is $1.85. This, while it seems also incredibly low already, is the second most expensive in South Asia. In Bangladesh, for example, it's 99 cents, and in Sri Lanka, it is 78 cents. India is by far the cheapest in the world at this anyway. But this is just to provide some reference on how the proliferation of data access in conjunction with, say, end-to-end encryption, and that has kind of increased the instrumentalization of certain platforms, etc., made it easier to instrumentalize platforms and the internet in general to incite violence, for example. I'm just going to touch upon a couple of points in this presentation. So the first one is looking at how governments tend to implement reactive measures and look at things like blanket bans and shutdowns, rather than doing anything that's more targeted or nuanced. It looks at the deeper problem itself. While the blanket bans and shutdowns are usually implemented to curb mobilization and are justified as being done in response to threats to public order, and similarly, we see that happening in Sri Lanka at the moment, where social media platforms have been banned once again yesterday to kind of maintain public order following some anti-Muslim violence in specific regions. The problem with this ends up being that it limits the democracy of information sharing, and specifically in regions such as South Asia, where we have states that have history of excesses of violence by state agencies. It has the potential to exacerbate the problem, and also has the potential to, and it also doesn't necessarily stop the problem in itself. For example, just to go back to an issue that predates social media itself, when you look at the Sri Lankan Civil War, for example, before any kind of internet existed, there was a ban on certain media platforms and certain specific modes of information sharing. But the onset of the Civil War itself in 1983 with the Black July incident happened because of spread of rumors and spread of kind of misinformation through specific state media agencies, for example. So when there is a history of such incidents in the region, because this is obviously not restricted to Sri Lanka, similar things happen across the region. And in such context, this becomes a dangerous tool to implement, especially when it's targeted to limiting specific, more open modes of information sharing. What this also ends up doing is allowing users to find, even more harder to clamp down on modes of communication, which in the future then can be used by, say, terrorist groups, for example. There is also another aspect of these reactive measures, also the ongoing debate on end-to-end encryption, which is, of course, again, not restricted to the region itself, but within the region, it is a live concern as well. Once again, backdoors or blunt measures such as that don't necessarily seem very helpful. For example, and I mean, this is again a broader concern across not just South Asia. Another issue that comes up in the region itself is also enforcement of such say bans in specific social media or encrypted platform bans. So in Pakistan, for example, in 2016-17, after a series of attacks that were claimed by ISIS, for example, there was one person who was arrested. They got access to his phone, and it was found that they were using Telegram quite a lot. And then what the state did was they unofficially kind of restricted access to Telegram. But this does not prevent end-to-end encryption in itself. So there were other platforms that were still accessible, for example. So firstly, the demands for backdoors, for example, obviously have major concerns in terms of, say, privacy and leaving the platform open for other bad actors to actually, exploit those same backdoors. And secondly, the enforcement of such measures in itself is incomplete, even when they are attempted. The way forward, obviously, I would argue, is that to use information that is already available in the form of, say, metadata, for example, that has been used already, but kind of to increase the scale of it, and how tech companies and governments can work together to make that sort of easier, and kind of have multi-stakeholder engagement in the region with specific actors within the region in terms of civil society, private sector, as well as governments, and to devise, say, regulations and measures of implementing these. The final aspect of this that I would touch upon here is the need for more regional expertise on this specific subject as well. Because many, as I think was highlighted in the opening by Andrew as well, is a lot of the research on this has been, say, Western-centric. And that, while some of it can be translated and can be adaptable to other regional contexts as well, a lot of the specific issues are not captured within this. For example, even when it comes to identifying terrorist content on various platforms, there are specific channels and pages that can be missed even by, say, algorithms and machine learning, that someone who might have more language expertise or, say, a slightly more cultural grasp of the different channels and different influence networks that work, how they work within different social media platforms, might be able to connect some dots and access those platforms. So, for example, in Bangladesh, there is an Islamist preacher whose group has been banned, and he has been banned, and he's currently imprisoned. And while his videos have been taken down from a vast majority of sources on the internet, certain stray videos, for example, still find their way on different channels and different networks. And this may not even necessarily be on channels that focus on, say, Islamist preaching, for example, but just, they have other videos as well that don't necessarily deal with this topic, but then they have a couple of videos by extremist preachers. Similarly, the Tamil language content that was available quite widely in the past, not anymore, by the leader of the National Tawhid Jamaat, which was responsible for the latest attacks in Sri Lanka. While he himself had a pretty small platform, they were recycled by larger channels and larger platforms. Again, this is something that, with slightly more regional and language expertise, might be something that could be gotten front of. And finally, even beyond, say, simply identifying the content, regional expertise is important for tackling the issue, because this specific issue has multiple dimensions in the regional context. So it's not just, say, identifying content or looking at, say, specific religious extremist content, but in, say, Pakistan, for example, blasphemy is punishable by death. And when, say, platforms or companies are working with the state, for example, and then you have content that may be construed as, say, atheist or blasphemous, this becomes complicated to deal with for companies. And this is something that companies and governments do need to work together to kind of reconcile these issues. And finally, another thing that did come out of one of the investigations that did happen in Pakistan was the platforms were also used to identify targets for targeted killings. So simply looking at content that was shared by specific users, by high-profile users, and that was construed as being sectarian, as being blasphemous or atheist, or, say, secular and liberal, targets were chosen on the basis of this. This is something that, again, is something that requires, this is something that hasn't been explored necessarily in this context, and this is something that, again, would be required as a next step. So I'll end here for now and look forward to questions. Thank you.
I suppose I'll begin the discussion by kind of echoing Aaron's sentiments about the importance of these regional perspectives and kind of breaking what has often been a very kind of Western-centric discussion and discourse on these issues. I'll begin by, I guess, kind of providing you all with an opportunity to go deeper into an issue that I think is of great interest to everybody here, which is the transfer from online to offline. So the transfer from trends and patterns, behaviours that you might be able to see and analyse online, and how that actually ends up manifesting, for want of a better phrase, in the real world. And perhaps this is an inevitable question from a former human person, someone who spends most of their research time in the field. You all referred to really long-term conflicts, conflicts that have a very, very deep history. You spoke of Kashmir, decades long. You know that in Mindanao, when you speak to locals, they will talk about a centuries-long struggle. Could you speak a little bit more about the relationship between those online trends and the actual transfer, particularly in regards to Mindanao, where we know in Lanao del Sur, in Marawi, those who engaged, the large majority of the recruitment came from those who lived in impoverished, isolated villages that don't have electricity, let alone internet access. And perhaps you could reflect also on the example of Kashmir in the same way.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the Mindanao topic, because even Mindanao is not a single place. I mean, there are different towns, each have very different access to internet. So for example, in more urban cities like in Cotabato, which is the capital, you have many universities there. There are lots of reports that university students were recruited into the ISIS in Marawi, and so in those more urbanized areas, yes, internet play a role in the radicalization process, but there's always offline dimension. So even in Cotabato, a lot of students from Polytechnic, IT students were recruited, but a lot of the meetings still happened offline. And then internet was probably used just to facilitate, okay, from Cotabato, how many people come for training in Sarangani or in other parts of the island. So online, offline you can still see very big difference in Mindanao than, for example, in Indonesia. Now, a few years ago, I said, no, there's no such thing as purely online radicalization in Indonesia, but no, it's no longer the case. We see more and more cases of people who were radicalized online. But however, in most cases, the most successful attacks or plots are done by those who train offline, I mean, in the real world. And at least even for those who are radicalized online, they have to find a link to, group with proper training and everything to be successful.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting thought, because at least in Kashmir, why we took Kashmir, for example, when a lot of this debate started around the Islamic State, right? So 14, 15, at least in public discourse, otherwise it's been discussed a lot. But overall, like in India, which has more than 200 million Muslims, we have only had about 180 to 200 pro-Islamic State cases, so not necessarily ISIS cases. And do you care to take a guess how many were in Kashmir? 3. Right, so, but because Kashmir's offline, or the decades-long problems that have been offline for so long still remain the prevalent narrative. The narrative hasn't changed there. So even the pro-ISIS cases that happened in Kashmir, for example, I'll just illustrate one, in which in 2017 there was one single person who was quote-unquote disgruntled by his colleagues in a particular, much smaller sort of militant group in the valley. Went just outside Srinagar, shot a cop, and somehow managed to email Amak News that I've done it in your name, and please claim it. And Amak did. So they had nothing to lose at that point of time. So they did, and said, oh, this is the person who's done it. He's one of our fighters, and blah, 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 kind of thing. And suddenly, not overnight, but like within hours, we had this narrative of ISIS JNK. And we were just like, what? There is no such thing. Could you stop creating this? But because, which we talked about in London as well, Amak released that became front page news headlines in the rest of the country. And suddenly, and because the offline or the decades-long crisis is very ingrained in the thinking, any new disruptive factor is taken as a very sort of, we must address this immediately, which is very strange, because the majority of the pro-ISIS cases in India actually come from the state of Kerala, right? More than 36 of them. And that's because Kerala has a centuries-long direct relationship with the Gulf. So the radicalization in Kerala is actually mostly offline. It has very little to do with online. And the other cases that we've had seen in other states is predominantly online, because the offline ecosystems do not exist. So they get radicalized online. But Kashmir was a whole different sort of ballgame altogether. Everyone went after ISIS-JNK. Even the police chief of Kashmir used the narrative of ISIS-JNK while it didn't exist. Because in that kind of conflict zone, which is so tightly controlled by both a certain type of political thinking or the military, any sort of disruption, their immediate reaction is to try and kill it with a bullet. And it doesn't work quite that way. So Kashmir, despite having just 3 cases, still held most of the mind space when it came to online radicalization.
Aditya, could you kind of reflect also, I suppose, more from a counter perspective, I guess how governments within the region have kind of responded and how they've kind of interpreted this tension between the online and the offline, and this issue of transfer and causality?
Right. So I think perhaps contrary to many expectations, Pakistan has had a sort of more a less blunt approach to this in certain aspects. So as part of their National Counterterrorism Authority and the National Action Plan, they have kind of implemented a counter cyberterrorism drive, or attempted to implement, which although it kind of opens up the space and makes it easier to have a bottom-up response, they've created platforms that allow users to, say, anonymously report extremist content online, et cetera, but this, again, within the specific context of Pakistan, raises a lot of issues given their blasphemy law and the inclination and the possibilities of having, say, just people reporting others for, say, revenge or just on sectarian grounds, et cetera, and this is a major issue. But in terms of the approach in general, it is slightly less blunt and less, say, top-down, and doesn't close down the information channels while allowing for some sort of reporting to be done. On the other hand, say, in Sri Lanka, we've seen how the government has been sort of unprepared for something like what happened on Easter Day. There was, say, the Prime Minister himself reported that there were 32 foreign fighters who have come back into Sri Lanka, but they have not been able to arrest them because there was no law preventing people joining foreign terrorist organizations. So this, because, I mean, presumably because they have been, say, preoccupied with a civil war in the country for so many years, this is something that they seem to be unprepared for. In terms of the offline element as well, one more thing is that just general intelligence and tying it into how things work, say, online, and connecting it to communication channels is something, again, that Sri Lanka seemed to be unprepared for this specific attack. And in January, they did uncover stores of explosives and weapons that were connected to this attack, but they did not, the connection was not made at the time. So yeah, there are these aspects that do happen in Bangladesh, for example. It's also a lot more political, where, I mean, there is deep fragmentation between the major political parties, and the ruling Awami League party has frequently and constantly, emphasized, say, the sort of more Islamic links of the Bangladesh National Party, the opposition party, and so sort of in connection to that, they've also connected them with slightly more Islamist movements. Now the Jamaat-e-Islami group, which is the largest Islamist group in Bangladesh, for example, has some ties with, say, has been linked with, say, war crimes, et cetera, during the 1971 liberation war that they had in Bangladesh. And they have kind of used the online space to clamp down on these groups, and then that has left a lot of their members with sort of fewer opportunities to vocalize their oppositions, et cetera, in other ways, and has sort of fed into the growth of, say, other extremist groups such as the Ansarul Islam groups, and et cetera, et cetera.
Actually, maybe we could just broaden this discussion out in terms of the countermeasures. What have states in the region done to implement initiatives, I guess, beyond just bans and shutdowns? Can you go into, I guess, the nuances of some of those other approaches?
Yeah, so, I mean, so what Pakistan has done with their specific drives, for example, is one part of it. There are a lot of, say, in Pakistan, again, specifically, there are quite a few civil society movements that have attempted to tackle this issue. But in, say, other regions and other countries, so Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, for example, this has been fairly limited, and the state has remained quite blunt. Again, as we see with the current example of the Sri Lanka case as well, it has mainly been, say, raids and blanket, say, social media platform bans. So beyond the Pakistan example, currently it remains slightly limited. So even in India, for example, one of the demands that came in January from the state was to have some sort of compromise on the end-to-end encryption that WhatsApp employs, for example. But again, this poses a lot of issues in terms of opening up backdoors for bad actors and for privacy in general, and in cybersecurity more broadly. So this is still something that needs to be explored further by, I guess, for multi-stakeholder engagement, as I did mention.
Kabir, could you give us some insights into, I guess, the Indian law enforcement approach to this?
So it's interesting. I mean, Indian law enforcement is also fairly fractured when it comes to this thinking. A lot of people you go to working on a very sort of central government level will tell you, look, these companies, especially the app providers such as WhatsApp, which is huge in India, need to have ecosystems based in India that we can tap into if a law enforcement situation requires so. But on a more state level, while this is a very contentious issue and it's not going to get solved anytime soon, on a state level, I think the police forces of certain states that have seen, let's say, pro-ISIS radicalization happen, I think they have taken some good measures as well. The state of Telangana, for example, has probably the most successful de-radicalization program. And even some of the police officers that are very active on Facebook and Twitter, explain to us that even within the confines of what they can do in the current system of how the platforms operate and how the state governments operate, it is still possible to have a good counter-narrative programs and de-radicalization program within that system. So states like Telangana who have successfully shown that it can be done. Now, their model is getting incorporated into states like Kerala, which has seen a large number of people get radicalized. So it's still possible. It's a very lazy argument to just say the platforms are not doing anything, so we can't do anything anymore. I think there's a lot already being done, and that needs to be looked upon or studied more of how it's operating.
I thought perhaps now we could kind of dig a bit deeper into kind of some of the threat dynamics. You'd written an article for the New York Times, I think, like last year or before, which is a fantastic article. If you get a chance to read it, please do. And you'd looked into the issue of radicalization in migrant workers. I guess, could you kind of reflect on some of the core findings from that piece? And given the time that's passed since it was published, could you maybe talk about perhaps how dynamics had changed?
Yeah, so when we first did the research, from 2015 to 17, the scale of the problem was actually not very big, but it was very new. Before ISIS, there was no migrant workers that joined radical or extremist groups. So social media obviously played, it was obviously the game changer here. So people who worked overseas, Indonesia have over 2 million workers in East Asia, but also in Gulf countries, in Saudi Arabia, mostly women because they work as nannies, that kind of thing. And so when they were exposed to these things online, and that's why you see more of the case in East Asia where the labor rights actually are better. They have holiday, they have access to phone, whereas in Saudi Arabia, it's a different problem, it's exploitation. But since then, a lot of the women, for example, in Hong Kong, we have 150,000 laborers there, but at the time, the ones that we identified as exposed to extremism was only about 100, so it was really not. But we also emphasized that the proportionality of the problem, and since then, some of the most active ones have been deported. Some have gone to join their husbands in Syria. Some married, British fighters, African fighters. So this leads to the problem of mixed marriage that we have to anticipate as well with the returning fighters and the families, which we don't know whether they're going to go back to Indonesia or to the husband's country of origin. What about the children? What's the status? Anyway, but in terms of the migrant workers, the government, it was a shock. So there have been some measures, for example, pre-departure training, kind of just giving knowledge that, that there are potential exploitation problems, including from jihadis. They would, but this is what sometimes I disagree with some of the NGOs. I mean, they just don't acknowledge women's agency at all. It's just about, you're going to be brainwashed by these male extremists. They would date you and then they would lure you into bombing yourself. It's not like that, In many cases, these women actually did it out of their own will, and if anything, they feel empowered by doing so. So what we need is, alternative modes of empowerment, support network, and there's a lot of interest groups in Hong Kong. For example, on Sunday, the migrant workers gather at the park. They have a lot of activities like business, hobbies, other things. This is the kind of thing that we have to encourage rather than kind of stigmatizing them or other kinds of thing like that. And but with the international donors, because there's all this attention to migrant workers, all the money, $7 million going on just to migrant workers. So that would be what, 1 million each, because there aren't really that many that got radicalized. So, but I think we have to focus on the bigger problems in Indonesia, for example, prison. In the Philippines, the solution is not online but offline. You make sure that the new BBL, the new peace process, it actually works so that people don't get tempted by the idea of Islamic State as in ISIS anymore. So that's, real development, progress on the ground, rebuilding of Marawi. That's what we really need.
And there could be this. Clearly, there's there's kind of a bit of a connection here with what I was just saying to what you said before about Kerala, and I guess I'm interested in that, in exploring this idea of the diasporas and the flow of workers and the implications for how the threat has evolved.
Yeah, like just to put it in perspective, India has nearly or nearly 8 million workers in the Gulf, right? That's a big chunk. And a state like Kerala, for example, its economy is literally based on remittances, so the money actually coming from that side. But interestingly, of course, Kerala, in most of the cases that we've studied over the past 2 years now, most of the cases are in some way or the other more inclined towards offline radicalization than online. So it's people either who have been in Saudi Arabia or UAE or wherever it is and sort of fallen into this ideology, and then they come back and then they try to influence their immediate sort of circles rather than setting up a Facebook group and start preaching to anyone and everyone. But interestingly also, the first line of defense against this thinking is also the community that is trying to get radicalized, right? So for example, in one of the cases that we studied, there was this person who was not radicalized, but talking to his friends about, maybe I want to travel to Syria, this makes sense to me, so on and so forth. And the friends amongst themselves started talking, okay, how do we make this stop? And how, I don't, maybe it's a South Asian trait, I don't know, but as soon as they threatened or confronted the friend and said that if you keep on propagating this amongst us, amongst our peers and stuff, we are going to tell your parents what you're doing. And he stopped, right? So that sort of fear of the family coming to know, and what will the family think about, or what will the family go through, is actually a relevant sort of factor that comes into play here. So this, again, why am I giving this example is there's no online sphere involved here. No one went online, there's no messages exchanged, no one went on Facebook and started reading stuff. This is all because of migration and community. But the fight back also came from within the community, which is a very important point to note here, in my opinion.
I mean, from a counter-strategy perspective across this region, how have governments kind of understood the dynamics that have been discussed so far, particularly in regards to the migrant workers and diaspora? I mean, we don't. Are there strategies that have been in place to understand those issues?
So I think this is usually from more of a civil society point of view than government point of view. I think the data on this relatively is also quite sparse in terms of how many people from the diaspora go and join X, Y, and Z group in the Middle East, for example. The data on that remains sparse. But I think another aspect of this discussion is also, as has been discussed, moving towards, say, offline platforms, is a lot of the content that gets produced and consumed in the region is sort of a gateway to, say, either small platforms for communication purposes or towards, say, meetups, etc. So, for example, in Pakistan, when previously there used to be pages, most of them now taken down, they were also specific to specific districts or even electoral constituencies, for example. So they would have very targeted grievance-related posts on those, and they would know exactly what kind of triggers people have in terms of both being anti-state and, say, more sectarian issues as well. But in terms of the migration issue at large, data remains sparse with these other countries specifically. And again, it goes back to the point of, say, Sri Lanka, for example, being unprepared in terms of having returning foreign fighters, being prosecuted, for example. So this is an issue, and it's a broader issue across, I mean, not this specifically is not a broader issue, but in terms of how to tackle, say, the radicalization of migrant workers, for example, is still not something that's been targeted properly enough in the region.
Thank you. And we're going to open up to audience questions now. And what I might do is just give, as the microphones go around and people's hands go up, it'd be great if each of you could give a very, very brief, I guess, some recommendations, I guess, from your own perspective on how civil society has been mentioned by each of you, the importance of civil society. What kind of recommendations, if you could have one recommendation to either to the tech sector or to the government about how to empower civil society to have the kind of active role which you've all kind of spoken about here. We can work in reverse order.
Sure. So yeah, one of the key things I think is when devising regulations or devising legislation. So when we provide, say, recommendations for other areas of conflict, etc. as well, we talk about having bottom-up approaches and inclusive approaches to devising solutions. So I think something in this space as well, which would be quite useful, I think, would to have a similar approach, which is to have an inclusive interdisciplinary kind of discussion about these issues, about say a combination of, say, privacy issues or issues with that, say, law enforcement has with the end-to-end encryption, but then also issues with having those backdoors that tech companies can provide, what the issues with those are. So kind of having a comprehensive kind of composite discussion about this would lead to what I think would be more sustainable solutions, rather than having people talking at each other. So governments, for example, where Australia comes up with an anti-encryption kind of bill or whatever, and that's not feasible, not practical. So a more interdisciplinary kind of communication between, which includes civil society as well as private sector and government.
I think it's very important for the tech sector and the platform sectors to, of course, address a lot of concerns that exist at the moment, but also not allow governments to use the terrorism tag to get their way through on issues such as privacy. Right? For example, from a government's perspective, an internet shutdown in India solves a lot of things for them in Kashmir. And not many people, even in civil society there, tend to confront that till a certain level, right? But over the past 2-3 years, 19 other states in India have faced the same thing on communal issues, on other issues where the government's reaction is to just shut the internet down. Now that's that's them. If the tech companies are questioning the government, saying, okay, on the whole issue of terrorism, we think what you're saying is correct, but that may be not the best way to go about it. It has to be somewhere in the middle of where privacy issues and your issues converge, and we have to form solutions together. But the government would look for much sort of, would look to elbow its way through often on just using the terror tag and getting some regulations in. So I think that this sort of, this is where a lot of, at least community debates will come into play, where the convergence of the government and of the platforms can actually happen.
My first recommendation is don't spend more money on counter narratives. I mean, there's no evidence that it really worked, and most of the time, what really stopped people from getting further in the radicalization is families, people who are close to them, and so that's, it's just basic thing. And the other thing, I think that I think tech companies and other, should encourage more discussion. The problem is when, of course, giving, funding to civil society groups is good, but there's no definition of what constitutes online hate speech, what's online extremism, what's a legitimate criticism, political speech. This is the, difficult, tough issues that I think the the society just, have to confront themselves with, have to solve, because otherwise, with all the polarizing election in Indonesia, everywhere in the world, especially in Indonesia, when Islamism is a sensitive topic, because there is also other legitimate Islamist groups that participate in the election. So the conflation of these, just put everything from Islamism to violent extremism under the rubric of radicalism is just not very productive. A lot of people, groups, civil society groups, Muslim groups that could be partners were alienated and fully excluded from these programs because of the sensitivity.
So we'll start with the first question here, and then Dr. Bloom, and then 3.
Hi, thank you for those. Yeah, thank you for the really fascinating regional perspectives. My question was directly to Nava, and just really interesting hearing your sort of perspective on the increased agency now given to women because of the internet. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on how that's been perceived by male counterparts. So, do they encourage that? Is that now something that strategically they would kind of adopt, or do women face similar glass ceilings in their preferred choice of workplace?
Sorry, so the question is how in different groups they employ women differently? Or?
Yeah, so is it sort of encouraged now that women kind of involve themselves more agency, or do sort of male counterparts still resist?
Within the extremists, among the extremist groups, right? But not the law enforcement. No. Okay. So sorry. Yeah. All right. From the terrorist groups, actually, they very reluctantly allow women or take them in. Not officially. Even now, I think it's hard to find official fatwa from someone like al-Baghdadi or someone like that. There's nothing. There is some bits of pieces in An-Naba, for example, that explicitly encourage women to do jihad in the battlefield, but it only came in 2017, whereas the first suicide bombers in Indonesia was 2016, so a year ahead. But there are also controversies, debates within the extremist groups themselves, especially after the Surabaya bombing. So now women actually become less controversial. I mean, women combatants or bombers, but now children is the more sensitive topic. There was already open criticism from other ex-Jamaah Islamiyah extremists telling the ISIS ones, why do you send your kids to the battlefield in Syria? He's not, he was barely 11, so there's no obligation for children to perform this, what they call jihad. And so it's still, they reluctantly accept women. So in many cases, when women were able to do so, it's by forming their own cells or by working with their husbands or their immediate friends.
And Dr. Bloom?
Thank you for a fascinating panel. I guess I have a general question because, again, not knowing as much about Southeast Asia, have you observed whether there's a difference to what extent the groups are more or less likely to be co-opted or their issues co-opted by ISIS, depending on the strength of the group? Because it seems that there's a very significant difference in the extent to which ISIS can come in and absorb NTJ, but not Pakistani Taliban. So I'm wondering if there is some sort of inverse correlation between how strong and popular the group is locally and to what extent ISIS can sort of swan in, take over, and co-opt both the issues and personnel and be able to conduct operations. Thank you.
Excellent question. I'm Kabir, and then...
Yeah, I think that really plays out well if you study Kashmir, right? For example, I interviewed a pro-ISIS case that's in Indian courts right now, and one of the questions that another person who was with me posed to this fairly well-read person was that why, despite all the narratives and all, why not Kashmir? Like, why is there no sustained presence in Kashmir? And he said, well, because Kashmir at the moment is a war between the non-believers, which is the Indian Army, and the nationalists and the patriots, which is Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish, bunch of other groups. And it's a war of land. It's not about ideology. They're mostly fighting about land. And frankly, at the moment, we're just not interested. the Islamic State's capacity is not comparable to try and come in Kashmir and try to swoop any group, because it is so, the lines are very strongly drawn on what each group is fighting for and whom they are fighting for. So, and it's very sort of, even the pro-ISIS narrative that comes in Kashmir, which, as I said, where you can see pro-ISIS graffiti in Srinagar in some parts, comes from people who supported the freedom movement or the Azadi movement, but have been, or feel they've been shortchanged by the leaders of the freedom movement, and that it's not going anywhere. So they'll start looking for an alternative, and ISIS is something that they have explored ideologically, right? So it's not gone beyond that. But because there's such strong lines and such strong ideas in Kashmir, the ISIS has actually not, they've tried, but no one has actually managed to develop a strong foothold there.
We do have one more question here, but did you have anything to add to that, just quickly?
Sure. So I think it is interesting how it plays out in different countries in South Asia, because if you look at it, there are slight variations between, say, the ideologies of different groups that exist in a country and then who ISIS chooses to affiliate with. So, for example, in Bangladesh, you have, the JMB, the Jamaat al-Mujahideen Bangladesh. So they've kind of tried and aligned with them because they have slightly a wider vision of kind of implementing a, Islamist caliphate, for example, rather than the Ansar al-Islam, which had a vision of more kind of just reacting to people who speak out against Islam and who are, according to them, blasphemous, etc., and say liberal, secular, atheist bloggers, for example, who they targeted. And the Neo-JMB has a broader vision, and that is the group they decided to kind of affiliate with. And similarly, in Sri Lanka, the NTJ, already even before the attack happened, so some of this content, the Tamil language content that was floating around online, was being recycled on ISIS-affiliated pages. So this didn't happen post, the attack itself, but it wasn't at a scale that we've seen with other groups, for example. And in Pakistan, we've seen them affiliate with, with sectarian groups, so the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, for example, and splinters of the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, so the Jamaat-ul-Ahrar, who are slightly more hardline. So they do pick and choose their groups based on, I think, what fits closest to what they have as a vision.
And the last question.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Sagero. I'm a president of an organization and a company called Sagero's International Group, based here in Washington, D.C. I think one thing that was missing in counterterrorism was technology, which is happening now because these people used technology, but people didn't understand. And also, including local people on the ground, civil society and the private sector. They were never included. It was always about policy. Policy wasn't fighting terrorism like in Africa. Africa has more cell phones, especially Kenya. Cell phones in the world. So why can't we use these cell phones by collaborating with local people to fight counterterrorism? So we need that inclusion in schools, in civil society, in communities, because we have to collaborate no matter what it is, though the government sometimes has civil society, doesn't like civil society, and those people are as smart as you guys, the terrorists. So we need this inclusion in education. The technology companies need to look at a curriculum where we can all fight this, working with people like us on the ground and all over the world. This is a global solution. This is a global problem. So what do you think about this? Should it be in the curriculum? We leave to the government? We leave to you guys just talking about tech like policy? Or what do we do? Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll take that as a comment. Did you have a question that you wanted to ask as well?
Hi, Carl Gollivan, a retired U.S. Customs Special Agent, 9/11 responder, domain reference, and idea liveson.net. Most nation states maintain a authority and capability to engage in covert actions which are plausibly deniable and from the outside would appear to be terrorist incidents, which sometimes are contrived as false flag events which can be blamed on a preferred enemy. Is it a responsibility of a global research network to counter government's tendencies to also engage in covert false flag terrorism, as well as radical entities that just independently engage in terrorism.
So perhaps you'd like to respond to the role of civil society and education and kind of technology and education in PVE kind of initiatives.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I'll just give an example, not necessarily on terrorism, but let's say just fighting a narrative. I mentioned Telangana earlier, which has a very good sort of counter, extremism approach to it. And one of the police officers has started this program, not on counterterrorism. I'm just saying how the technology sort of can be used, but to counter fake news. And fake news, nothing to do with politics. But the fake news was that the fact that in Telangana, majority of the population, or not a majority, but a large section of the population is either tribal or, they don't have, or they're not educated per se, but they still have access to smartphones and to data. And in one of the instances on WhatsApp, because everyone's on WhatsApp, there was, in one of the villages, there was fake news distributed that there is some person roaming around stealing children. Right, so it ultimately came down to this program run by the Telanganese government to actually go out and educate these tribals of how fake news on WhatsApp works. Right, so it's a collaboration of a lot of things. In some instances it works, in some instances it may not work. But I think it's been tried out on various issues and platforms, not necessarily on CT, but in general.
I was going to respond to the second one. Yeah, so I think that comes down to a broader definition issue of just terrorism in general, and we haven't been able to agree on one for decades and don't seem to be any closer to doing that. And I think it's kind of hard for, say, private sector or anyone to make recommendations on the basis of assumptions that essentially, yes, covert operations happen, and if we kind of consider those as terrorism, then we can't expect states to implement any of the solutions anyway. So this I think comes down to a broader definition issue, and once we kind of resolve that, whenever that is, then we might be able to kind of discuss covert operations as connected to terrorism, extremism, for example.
And final comments.
In the covert operation, I think what, in the case of Indonesia, really, why some of the fundraising for terror activities actually haven't really worked, or just the extremists just don't buy it because they think it's a covert operation by the government, it's an entrapment. So it's interesting because so the successful fundraising is usually one that is framed as support for the families of convicted or martyred terrorists. If you frame it as, oh, we're gonna build this bomb laboratory, please donate money, that has happened in Indonesia, it has, but it also generated a lot of controversy, and then rumors of spies, and it really disrupted the online network. So what we see as have effectively worked in Indonesia, rather than counter messaging, is actually this creating confusion and suspicion of spy within the online network.
And on that note, please thank the panelists for today. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.